They looked at me with desperate eyes, pleading for something I never thought I'd give. I should have said no. I should have walked away. But I didn't. And now, I live with the consequences. In that moment, the weight of my own loneliness made me reckless. I knew I'd regret it. I knew. But I still did it. Have you ever stood at the edge of a decision, knowing the moment you take that step, there's no turning back? Your mind screams at you to stop, but something deeper pulls you in. That was me. People think betrayal happens in one big moment. It doesn't. It starts small. A glance that lingers too long. A touch that wasn't supposed to mean anything, but does. Before you even realize it, you're somewhere you swore you'd never be. And the worst part? A part of you doesn't even want to leave. This is my story. And by the time I'm done, you'll understand why I can never take back what I did. And why, a part of me never really wanted to. If you love unraveling shocking true stories like this, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. My name is Donald. I'm a man who's always done what was expected of him. Worked hard. Provided. Kept my head down. I built a life that looked good on the outside, but inside, it felt like I was fading. I have a wife. We've been together for years. At some point, we stopped being partners and became something else. Strangers living under the same roof. Routine replaced affection. Silence filled the spaces where laughter used to be. She doesn't look at me the way she used to. Doesn't ask how I'm feeling. I stopped asking her, too. Maybe that's just how marriage works after a while. You get used to the absence of warmth. I wake up early, go to work, come home, and sit through quiet dinners where we barely speak. She's always busy. Phone in hand, mind somewhere else. And I pretend it doesn't bother me. But it does. I feel invisible in my own home. Like a ghost haunting a life that no longer belongs to me. And then, there's her. My stepmother, Evelyn. She married my father years ago, but we were never close. She always had an air about her, poised, confident, always in control. The kind of woman who could command attention without saying a word. But beneath all that strength, there was something else. A loneliness that mirrored my own. Her marriage to my father was nothing more than an arrangement. He provided for her, gave her stability, but he never gave her love. He barely even saw her. I never paid much attention before. But then, things started to change. She lingered a little longer in conversations. She looked at me differently. There was something in her eyes, a quiet understanding. Like she knew exactly what I was feeling. And then, there was Susan. My sister, though not by blood. Younger than me, but not by much. She was always the lively one. The one who laughed easily, who had this effortless way of making people feel seen. But lately, I noticed a change in her, too. She wasn't the same carefree girl I remembered. She was carrying something heavy. A sadness she tried to hide, but I could see it. She started confiding in me. Late-night talks in the kitchen when everyone else had gone to bed. She told me things she didn't tell anyone else. About how lost she felt. How she needed someone to really listen to her. I listened. Maybe more than I should have. The house felt different lately. The air was thick with something unspoken. Every glance held something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't just me anymore. We were all reaching for something. Something we weren't supposed to want. And the closer we got to the edge, the harder it became to step back. It started on a Saturday. Nothing unusual, just a small gathering at my father's house. A family dinner. One of those nights that should have been forgettable. Just another evening of polite conversation, forced smiles, and the kind of small talk that fills the silence without ever meaning anything. But this night was different. I felt it the moment I walked in. My stepmom was in the kitchen, moving with that quiet grace of hers, but something about her seemed different. Her movements slower, more deliberate. She wasn't just preparing food, she was waiting. Watching. I felt her eyes on me before I even looked at her. And Susan, she was already at the table, swirling her wine glass, staring at the deep red liquid like it held answers she couldn't find anywhere else. I sat down. The usual greetings were exchanged, but the words felt empty. Just background noise. The real conversation was happening in the spaces between the words, in the way Evelyn's fingers lingered on the edge of the table, in the way Susan let out a breath that sounded heavier than it should have. I didn't know it yet, but I was already sinking. The dinner started normally enough. Plates passed around, idle chatter, the kind of forced normalcy that families maintain even when everything beneath the surface is unraveling. Then Susan turned to me. "You ever feel like you're just existing?" Her voice was quiet, almost thoughtful, but there was something else in it. Something raw. I glanced at her. "What do you mean?" She exhaled, shaking her head. "Like, no matter what you do, no one really sees you. Like you could disappear, and it wouldn't even matter." I didn't answer right away. I knew that feeling too well. Too intimately. Evelyn set down her glass. "That's what marriage does to you," she said, voice smooth but edged with something bitter. "You start out thinking you're building a life together, but one day, you wake up and realize, you're alone." Silence. The kind that fills the room like thick smoke, impossible to ignore. I should have changed the subject. I should have said something light, something that would steer us back to safer ground. But instead, I let it sit. Let it settle into the spaces between us. Susan looked at me then. Really looked at me. And I saw it, the need. The quiet desperation of someone who just wanted to be understood. And then Evelyn spoke again, softer this time. "Maybe some people aren't meant to be satisfied with what they have." Her fingers traced the rim of her glass, slow, methodical. The way she said it, it wasn't a statement. It was an invitation. I swallowed. I should have walked away right then. But instead, I stayed. I listened. And I let the moment linger a little too long. That night stayed with me. Long after I left, long after the house had fallen into silence, the conversation echoed in my mind. Evelyn's voice, smooth and knowing. Susan's eyes, searching for something I wasn't sure I could give. I told myself it was nothing. Just words. Just a family dinner. But it wasn't. Something shifted that night. A boundary blurred, so subtle it was almost imperceptible. Almost. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my wife asleep beside me, her back turned, just like always. The distance between us felt wider than ever. I thought about the way Evelyn had spoken, the way Susan had looked at me. The weight of their words pressed against me, heavy and undeniable. I tried to shake it off. It didn't mean anything. I was imagining things. Overthinking. But deep down, I knew better. Because when I closed my eyes, I didn't see my wife. I saw them. The next day, everything felt different. I was hyper-aware of everything, every glance, every touch, every moment that felt like more than it should have been. Susan brushed past me in the hallway, and I felt it. That pause. That hesitation. A moment stretched just a little too long. Evelyn caught my eye across the room, holding my gaze just a second longer than necessary. A flicker of something unreadable in her expression before she looked away. It was subtle. Almost imperceptible. But it was there. And I knew. They felt it too. I told myself it was harmless. They needed comfort. It wasn't wrong to listen. To be there. To care. But then, why did it feel like I was standing at the edge of something dangerous? Why did my heart beat just a little too fast when Susan leaned in closer than she needed to? Why did my skin burn when Evelyn's fingers grazed mine, so light it could have been an accident, but wasn't? And why did I want it? I started noticing everything. The way Susan's voice softened when she spoke to me, the way her laughter lingered when I was near. The way Evelyn's presence filled the room, a quiet pull I couldn't ignore. They weren't just talking to me anymore. They were testing me. And I was letting them. I knew this was dangerous. I knew it could destroy everything. And yet, I didn't stop it. It didn't stop. It got worse. Or maybe, worse isn't the right word. Maybe it just became something I couldn't ignore anymore. Because once a line is blurred, once a thought is entertained, it takes root. It lingers. And before you even realize it, you've already crossed into dangerous territory. It started small. Late-night conversations that stretched longer than they should have. Susan would text me, nothing outright inappropriate, but different. More personal. She'd tell me about her day, her frustrations, how she felt stuck, unseen. And I'd respond. At first, I told myself I was just being a good brother. Just listening. Just offering support. But the way she spoke to me, the way her words lingered, the way she'd hesitate before sending a message, as if waiting for me to say something she wasn't sure she was allowed to say, I felt it. And then there was Evelyn. She wasn't texting me. No. She was more subtle than that. A hand on my arm that stayed a second too long. A touch against my back when she walked past me in the kitchen. A glance held just a beat longer than necessary. It was in the way she positioned herself closer to me when we talked. The way she spoke, slow and measured, like she knew exactly what she was doing. And I let her. I let both of them. Because the truth was, I needed it. I had spent so long feeling invisible, so long pretending it didn't bother me that my wife had stopped noticing me, that I had stopped noticing myself. But now? Now, I was being seen. It reached a breaking point one night. It was late. Too late. I should have been home. But I wasn't. We had all stayed back after dinner, my wife had already gone to bed, leaving just the three of us. Evelyn poured another glass of wine, swirling it in her hand. She was sitting across from me, her legs crossed, her gaze unwavering. Susan sat beside me, closer than usual. Close enough that I could feel the warmth of her body, close enough that when she spoke, her breath brushed against my skin. The air was thick with something unsaid. A kind of tension that doesn't just appear, it builds. Slowly. Carefully. Until it becomes impossible to ignore. Susan set her glass down. You ever think about what would happen if we stopped pretending? Her voice was soft, but the weight of her words hit me like a stone. I swallowed. My pulse pounded in my ears. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, watching me. Studying me. I didn't answer. I didn't move. Because this was it. This was the moment. The edge. And then, with just one word, one touch. I gave them exactly what they wanted. I didn't stop it. I could have. I should have. But I didn't. Susan was so close I could feel the warmth of her body against mine, her breath shallow, uneven. Her fingers traced slow circles against the back of my hand. A touch so small, so insignificant, except it wasn't. Because I felt it everywhere. Across from us, Evelyn watched, silent. There was no shock, no hesitation. Just, understanding. Like she knew this was always where we were going to end up. I told myself to get up. To leave. To put distance between us before this became something we couldn't undo. But then Susan whispered, "Tell me you don't want this." And I couldn't. Because that would be a lie. A slow exhale left my lips. My mind screamed at me to step back, to think, to be rational. But my body had already made the choice. Evelyn leaned forward, setting her glass down, the quiet clink of it against the table somehow deafening. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The way she looked at me, steady, knowing, said everything. A question. An invitation. I turned back to Susan. Her eyes searched mine, waiting for permission. I could still stop this. I could still walk away. But I didn't. I reached for her. The moment our lips met, the world around us collapsed. It wasn't soft. It wasn't careful. It was desperate. Messy. Inevitable. Evelyn didn't leave. She didn't stop us. She watched. And then she reached for me, too. The moment it was over, silence fell. Not the kind that feels peaceful. The kind that weighs on you. The kind that tells you something has irrevocably changed. I sat there, breathing hard, my mind catching up to what my body had just done. Susan's head rested against my shoulder, her fingers tangled in mine. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly, her expression unreadable. I felt it then, the regret. A sharp, gut-punching weight pressing down on my chest. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a betrayal. Of my wife. My own morals. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to feel only regret. Because buried beneath the guilt, beneath the shame, was something I wasn't ready to admit. I had spent so long being invisible. So long being ignored, cast aside, unloved. And now? I wasn't invisible anymore. But at what cost? Susan pulled back first. She looked at me, something hesitant flickering across her face. What does this mean for us? Her voice was quiet, fragile, like she wasn't sure if she wanted the answer. I swallowed hard, unable to meet her eyes. Evelyn spoke next. No one can ever know about this. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a fact. I finally forced myself to look at them. Susan, who had always been the innocent one. Evelyn, who had always been the composed one. And me. The one who had ruined everything. I exhaled, rubbing a hand over my face. I don't think I can look her in the eyes again. My wife. The person who still believed I was the man I used to be. But that man was gone. And the worst part? A part of me didn't want him back. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that moment. The heat of it. The desperation. The way my hands had moved instinctively, as if guided by something beyond reason. And now, as the first slivers of daylight bled through the curtains, I was left with the cold, undeniable truth of what I had done. I sat on the edge of my bed, my wife still fast asleep behind me, her breathing steady, peaceful. She didn't know. She had no idea that while she slept, I had been somewhere else, someone else. I pressed my palms against my face, willing the feeling away, but it clung to me like damp air after a storm. The shame. The guilt. But beneath it, something else. A pull. A whisper in the back of my mind that refused to be silenced. I told myself it was over. That what happened last night was a mistake, a terrible, unforgivable mistake. But deep down, I already knew the truth. This wasn't over. The house was quieter than usual that morning. I walked into the kitchen, expecting to feel normal again, to slip back into routine as if last night hadn't happened. But the moment I saw her, I knew that was impossible. Evelyn stood by the coffee machine, pouring herself a cup, her movements as fluid and poised as always. She didn't acknowledge me right away, didn't look up as I stepped into the room. For a second, I thought, maybe she regretted it, too. Maybe she was going to pretend it never happened. And then, she turned. Met my gaze. And smiled. Not a big smile. Not an obvious one. Just the slightest curve of her lips. A knowing look. A quiet, unshakable confidence. Like she was completely in control. Like nothing had changed for her. But for me? Everything had. I swallowed hard, reaching for a glass, just to give my hands something to do. "Sleep well?" she asked. Her voice was calm. Smooth. Like she was amused by something only she understood. I didn't answer. Couldn't. Because how do you respond to that when your mind is still replaying the feel of her skin against yours? Susan walked in a few minutes later. And the shift was immediate. She didn't look at me. Not even once. Her shoulders were tense, her movements stiff, like she was afraid to get too close. She mumbled something about needing to leave soon, then grabbed a cup of coffee and practically fled the room. I watched her go, my stomach twisting. I should have felt relief. Should have been glad that at least one of us had enough sense to put distance between what had happened. But instead, all I felt was uncertainty. Was she ashamed? Or was she scared? Not of what we had done, but of what it meant. The rest of the day was a blur. Conversations I couldn't focus on. Tasks I barely completed. I kept checking my phone, half expecting a message, half dreading one. But nothing came. Susan avoided me. Evelyn went on as if nothing had happened. And I? I was trapped somewhere between regret and longing. The fear of getting caught warred with the temptation to go back. To feel that again. Because no matter how hard I tried to convince myself that last night was just a mistake, one night, one reckless decision, I knew better. It wasn't just a moment of weakness. It was the beginning of something I couldn't stop. That night, just as I was about to go to bed, my phone buzzed. I picked it up, my pulse spiking the second I saw the name. Susan. One message. "We need to talk." I barely had time to process it when I felt something else. A presence. I looked up. Evelyn was standing at the doorway, watching me. She didn't speak. Didn't need to. Her expression said it all. This wasn't over. It was only the beginning. I stared at the message on my screen. "We need to talk." 2 simple sentences. But they carried the weight of everything I had been trying, and failing, to push down. I could still hear the silence of the house settling around me. The low hum of the refrigerator. The faint creak of the wooden floorboards under my feet. Evelyn had already walked away, but the ghost of her presence lingered. And Susan? She was waiting for an answer. My fingers hovered over the screen. What was I supposed to say? "We shouldn't have done this. I regret it." Both would have been lies. I should have felt only guilt. Only shame. But instead, I felt something else. Something I hated myself for. I wanted more. The next morning, I woke up feeling hollow. The sun filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the ceiling. My wife was still asleep beside me, her breathing steady, oblivious. I turned onto my back, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the sick feeling curling in my stomach. Was I really the villain in this story? Or was I just a man who had been neglected for too long, a man who had been starving for something, anything, to remind him that he was still alive? I told myself that. Over and over. That I wasn't the monster. That I was just human. But even as I whispered those excuses to myself, they rang hollow. I had made a choice. I had stepped over the line, and now, there was no erasing it. I avoided Susan that morning. I knew she was waiting for me to respond. But I wasn't ready. Evelyn, on the other hand. She made no effort to avoid me. She was standing by the kitchen window, drinking her coffee like it was just another day. Like she hadn't been part of the very thing keeping me awake all night. She glanced at me over the rim of her mug, a faint smirk curling the edges of her lips. Not mocking. Not cruel. Just certain. Like she already knew what I was thinking. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but what? That it was a mistake? That it could never happen again? I wasn't even sure I believed that. And Evelyn, she knew it. She took one last sip of her coffee, set the mug down, and walked past me. As she did, she let her hand brush against mine. Light. Barely there. But deliberate. And in that moment, I realized something that should have terrified me. She didn't regret it. Not at all. I finally saw Susan later that day. She was sitting on the back porch, knees drawn up to her chest, staring out at nothing. I almost turned around. Walked away. Pretended I hadn't seen her. But I didn't. I couldn't. So I sat down next to her. She didn't look at me right away. Just kept staring at the horizon like she was searching for something she couldn't find. Then, finally, she spoke. What happens now? Her voice was quiet. Fragile. I didn't answer. Because I didn't know. Did we pretend it never happened? Act like we could go back to how things were before? That was the logical thing to do. The right thing. But as she finally turned to face me, as her eyes met mine, I knew. We weren't going back. Not now. Maybe not ever. I could feel it pulling me in. The secret. The danger. The inevitability. I wanted to undo what had been done. To take it all back. But deep down, I knew the truth. If given the chance, I would do it again. So now I ask you. If you were in my shoes, what would you do? Would you walk away? Pretend it never happened? Bury it deep inside and hope that the guilt fades with time? Or is there no turning back? Because that's the thing about moments like this. Once you've crossed the line, once you've felt something you weren't supposed to feel, how do you ever go back to the way things were? I tell myself it was a mistake. That I should stop now before it gets worse. But then I think about the way Susan looked at me. The way Evelyn moved so confidently, so sure of what this was. I think about the way my wife still sleeps beside me, unaware. The way my father still trusts me, oblivious. And I wonder. Is it really regret that's keeping me up at night? Or is it something else? Something deeper. Something I don't want to admit. Loneliness makes you do things you never imagined. And sometimes, the weight of desire is heavier than the burden of guilt. What would you have done? Drop a comment below. Was this a tragic mistake, or was it inevitable? And if you want more stories like this, if you want to hear how it all unfolds, subscribe. Because trust me, you won't believe what happens next.